Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in on another webinar session of Strategy International. We're very glad to have you all on board and being able to watch our webinars through not only our website, but also our YouTube channel. Welcome again to our speakers. I got with us today Professor Frédéric Lemieux from Georgetown University. And I also have with us today Professor Francis Shortgen from the University of Utah in Asia. Actually, I'm very glad because we are connecting the world through Cyprus, where on the one hand, we have the professor on the west side of this planet Earth in Washington, D.C., and Professor Shortgen in South Korea. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us in today. I'm very glad to have you on board with us, and we will be delighted to hear of your opinions. Just allow me to say that Strategy International is a consulting and a think tank company where the idea is to bring some of the brightest minds together in having the opportunity to discuss things as we are going into today, into Asia. Last week, we were talking about European elements, mainly the war in Ukraine. And this week, we're going to have the opportunity to talk about Asia itself. I'm very proud, as I said, to introduce with you Professor Frédéric Lemieux, who's going to be our first speaker. Frédéric, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marius. So, yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm very, glad to be here and discuss this, issues that we're seeing in Asia and in the West Pacific areas in general. I wrote a paper, a monograph on the situation in Taiwan. And that is really something that right now preoccupates me. I have a background in intelligence, cybersecurity, technology, and so on. But the geopolitics right now that it's going on in that region of the world is very interesting. Just to show a couple of things, like I would say major shift that should really grab our attention here is first of all, very recently, Xi Jinping was, asserted as the supreme leader of the Communist Party of China, and really kind of in his discourse of opening and closing was able to identify a roadmap for China and its influence in the region. And it also englobed, if you want, and I will talk about that in a minute, like also the influence and the impact of North Korea as well in the region. And so what is interesting is there's some tectonic shift happening. So, for example, a few years ago, right before the beginning of the pandemic, we saw China cracking down on Hong Kong, clearly putting aside one of its promise to let Hong Kong flourish as it was, as a kind of a different system, political system than mainland China, and really crack down on freedom of the press, really crack down on the governance of Hong Kong, to really become the controlling body of Hong Kong, and that really send a signal about, if you want, the assertiveness of China in that region of the world. Now we are talking about a possible or a similar kind of attempt on Taiwan. And this could take different, could have different outcomes. It could also different process. It could be like a blockade. It could be also a full-scale invasion. Could be also a waiting time, like waiting out on the U.S. to get tired and maybe just let it go. In fact, there is signal that the U.S. might have a change of heart by, with the new bill that they passed in the U.S. for semiconductors being relocated elsewhere than Taiwan, and start production of semiconductor in the U.S. I think that might be a signal that there will be limitation to the support that the U.S. might grant to Taiwan. Who knows? But more importantly, one of the major change that we observe in that area of the world is a nuclear North Korea as well. So that is really changing. I would say like the power play, if you want. You can see, for example, North Korea being a little bit more assertive, a little bit more independent, a little bit more like provocative, and it also offer China and a conduit on Taiwan that was not necessarily there before. Can increase, if you want, the cost of the West that would like to defend Taiwan here to have to make very difficult choice in that area. So you have that. You have also an increased presence, or at least an increased activity in the Russian presence in that area too, like with doing a lot of naval drill with China, like doing exercise of encircling different islands, like including Japan at some point. So and also like showing off on the coast of Alaska and everything like that. So you see that, and more recently, I don't know if you noticed that, but about 24 hours ago, Russia, surprisingly, I mean, or not, decided to deploy anti-missile systems on Kuril Island, which is very close to Japan, which seems a little bit ironic because it cannot even defend its, Air Force bases deep in the country from the Ukrainian, but they will start to have a air defense system on that island. So that's an interesting signal that the Russians are sending here in terms of the military presence and maybe their intention of supporting any kind of move from China against Taiwan. Another interesting fact, and I will close on that just to like put the table on my perception on what's going on and what seems very important or noticeable, is the fact that the US is not only deploying its strategic bomber in Australia, the nuclear strategic bomber in Australia, but just a few hours ago, I think it was overnight, hit the press. They will double the rotation teams of those nuclear bomber to make even them more ready for a strike. So that is also concerning signals on what's going on in that part of the world. So I will stop there. I've tried to, from my perspective, put the table and provide a backdrop of, some of the change in the past 2 years, where we see, and something that I would like to say also, it's this apparent, but I would say like reinforcing kind of like ties between China, North Korea, and Russia. And there's something here that it seems to get stronger. It's over Ukraine, but it's also probably over Taiwan and some claims over the South China Sea. So there's something here that is moving and not necessarily in the direction we would like.
Thank you very much, Frederick. And actually, to say to our audience that Frederick has been publishing quite many interesting strategic analysis with regards to East Asia and South Asia itself. Actually, he was on the spot with regards to some of the very last incoming developments that we're going to have the opportunity to also hear out from Francis. The idea is, again, and I'll have to repeat that Strategy International collaborates with some of the brightest minds in order to be able to decipher, if you want, what is now happening in the world. We live in an era of geopolitical and geostrategic changes, which are vast and multidimensional. They don't only happen with regards to military affairs, but also trade, business, transport, technology, and all other elements that might affect our economy directly or indirectly, and that do also affect us personally or collectively. Thank you very much, Frederick. I'll come back to you, but I'll give the floor now to Francis. Francis, thank you very much. I know it's kind of late also in South Korea, but thank you very much for joining us in. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marius, and the pleasure is all mine. And thank you, everybody who's tuning in. And thank you, Frederick, for nicely setting the stage for our discussion. I think you hit on a number of issues that I was also going to touch on. So on some of those I may elaborate on a little bit. And since I'm based in South Korea, let me maybe start with the tension on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, this is something that the people that live here, of course, have been used to for basically the past 70 plus years. This is not necessarily unusual. It's not rattling people as much as outsiders might necessarily think, even though the saber rattling on the part of North Korea with the unprecedented number of missile tests that Kim Jong-un has engaged in the last year, or the last couple of weeks really, has been truly unprecedented. But while it has not gone unnoticed in South Korea, it hasn't really fazed the public, again, because they are more used to this. It's sort of predictable. Every time that South Korea and the United States start large-scale military maneuvers, that's when you can more or less bet your money that North Korea will engage in that saber rattling, if for no other reason than to probably also get some attention and signal that they're still here and they might have security concerns. And every time the military maneuvers happen, the North Korean regime doesn't miss a beat to basically say that the United States is gearing up for a potential first strike, and then that's when you have that show of force, that forceful force, as the North Koreans essentially referred to it. So tit for tat upmanship, if you will. So those tensions are here to stay for the foreseeable future, I think. And there's of course the concern that North Korea is gearing up for a potential 7th nuclear test. If that were to happen, the sentiment in South Korea might shift a little bit more in favor of the South Koreans developing an indigenous nuclear capability. There have been surveys done both in 2021 and also in 2022 that surprisingly show that anywhere from about 71 to 74% of the South Korean public would be in favor of South Korea having some kind of indigenous nuclear deterrence. And I think this is also coming on the heels of the past U.S. administration, when Donald Trump had sort of signaled to some allies, both in Europe and South Korea, that you may not necessarily count on the backing of the U.S. in all instances. So it certainly in Europe, we had seen that the then Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, had said, we can count on the United States. We have to have our own capabilities. And in South Korea and maybe in Japan, you also have seen that there's a recalibration going on in case that the United States might not live up to its defense commitments. And if you look at the missile tests that the North Koreans have engaged in, I think it was a signaling, kind of what Frederick had already suggested. There's a lot of signaling coming out, not just from China and Russia, but certainly also from North Korea. And the signaling being that the North Korean regime wants to send a message to Washington, D.C. that we can actually purportedly reach the U.S. shores. So it's an attempt to drive a wedge in the South Korea-United States alliance as well. And this is a tactic that we have seen on a number of occasions that North Korea has engaged in. The other issue that is getting a little bit more prominence is, of course, this long-standing, it's not a tension per se, but the historical baggage, let's put it that way, in the South Korea-Japan relationship. And that baggage sort of comes to the surface every now and then, going back to Japan's World War II activities and the fact that it has never fully apologized. And there were tensions between South Korea and Japan not that long ago when the Japanese government actually put limitations on the exports of critical chemicals that South Korean companies would need, especially electronics companies. And the military intelligence information that was supposedly being shared between South Korea and Japan, that also stopped under the previous administration for a while. So we have now a President Yoon Suk-yeol, who has said that he would be working very aggressively to bring that relationship with Japan back on a more solid footing again. And all of that, of course, would be in the interest of the United States as well, because if you have two of your biggest allies in the region not getting along, I think from a strategic point of view, that would actually serve not only North Korea well, but also China. And China is, of course, the number one player in the region, the number one player, you might say, from a geostrategic point of view, maybe going forward in the geopolitics as well. There you see a significant tension between the United States and China right now. The relationship is probably at its worst that it has been in quite some time, maybe going back to the late 1980s in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square. And if I may paraphrase the late Ambassador Mansfield, who was posted in Japan in the 1980s, if my memory serves me right, at that time he declared that the U.S.-Japan relationship was the single most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. Of course, nobody would dispute the fact that the number one bilateral relationship in the world today would be that between the U.S. and China. The fact that there's significant tensions there does not necessarily bode well. We have seen some encouraging signs in that first one-on-one meeting that President Xi Jinping and President Biden had. Of course, we have to see how that develops further. But the simple fact is that China is reasserting itself, has been for basically since 2008, when some people would say it had that coming out party on the heels of the Olympic Games in Beijing. And China has been carrying its weight around much more aggressively than ever before. We're no longer seeing China operating under the direction of what Deng Xiaoping had said, that you basically hide your capabilities, you bide your time, you don't take a leadership role. The current regime under Xi Jinping is much more assertive. We had seen it as soon as he came to power, when he said, we are working towards achieving the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. He pushed for a China dream, or a Chinese dream, depending on how you translate the Chinese version, Zhongguomeng. If it's the China dream, then of course it's the nation, and that might mean sort of geopolitically and geostrategically that China wants to be seen as sort of more of an equal with the United States. Xi Jinping had a few years ago called for a new great power relationship between China and the United States, which hasn't really gone anywhere. But we have to really take into account what China's assertiveness means, not just for the bilateral relationship, but also for geopolitics at large, and also for geoeconomics, because China has been deepening its presence around the world with the ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. It is expanding its influence through trade connections, through the internationalization of the renminbi, although there's still a long way to go there. But it's definitely expanding its presence. There is now more countries that use China as their number one trading partner than use the United States, and that's a significant shift. So there's a shift in the balance of geostrategic power and influence maybe going on, and the fact that the U.S. and China have some tensions right now injects a certain degree of unpredictability and uncertainty, and it behooves both countries to work on that relationship for sure, to make sure that we have geostrategic stability in the world going forward. You can have competition, but we have to make sure that that competition doesn't evolve into outright confrontation, if not outright, great power conflict, as some may have predicted. Some of the other issues that I would like to highlight, maybe on the more domestic front, in China, we have seen unprecedented demonstrations in recent weeks over the COVID restrictions. Now, if you have followed the news over the last few days, the Chinese government has gradually begun to walk back some of those restrictions in some of the major cities, but there's still some restrictions in terms of going into indoor places where you have to have negative tests and so on. But it remains to be seen as to whether or not that loosening of those restrictions is as a result of the unprecedented nature of those demonstrations, because what you also had seen is, after Xi Jinping has secured his third term, an unprecedented third term in office, and right at that same time, you had people basically calling for Xi Jinping and the whole leadership to step down. I think this is something that it's the greatest unrest that you have seen in a generation in China. And for Xi Jinping, that certainly must have hit home, because right now, him having secured that third term and sideline all his rivals, essentially, he has now a cabinet that is completely staffed with loyalists. The ball is in his court to make sure that he can revive the Chinese economy, to have it on the growth path that is higher than what it used to be. That's a tall order to begin with, and he cannot afford to have domestic unrest as a result as well. And of course, you have seen him come out and in the celebration of life, as we would call it in the U.S., the passing of Jiang Zemin. Xi Jinping has actually called for national unity, so that it's unmistakable what he's trying to get at. I think he was a little worried about the tensions that were unfolding domestically, and he's been trying to quell those for sure. You also do see the China-Russia relationship. Frederick mentioned that Russia is also becoming more assertive in the region. And then if you look at the China-Russia relationship, that has been, I wouldn't go so far as to call it, a formal alliance per se, but it's definitely an entente right now between the two powers, which have not always been on the best of speaking terms, certainly not during the Cold War years necessarily. But you have right now China and Russia cooperating on many fronts, certainly when it comes to military maneuvers and projecting force. And that is changing the geopolitical balance to some extent as well. And some would argue, and I made that point I am making the point in the paper that I'm writing with a colleague right now, that China-Russia entente may be a response to U.S. foreign policy, both towards Russia and towards China. So that you create a much greater bloc that the United States has to react against, and they may not have the capabilities at the moment. So we're really seeing a resurgence of what John Mearsheimer, the dean of the realist school in international affairs these days, would have called the tragedy of great power politics, that book that he wrote back in 2001 and revised in 2014. I think that tragedy is playing out between China, Russia, and the United States at the moment. So those are some of the things that I think I would like to highlight at the moment. And maybe one last issue that Frederick also mentioned, the Taiwan issue, the Taiwan Strait tensions. That's certainly on everybody's mind for sure. And I'd like to connect it a little bit to the North Korea tensions as well. You have in Asia right now, for a number of years already, this is the one region in the world that has seen a significant increase in the arms race, which is destabilizing in its own right. China has not used its leverage the way it could or should with regard to reining North Korea in. We have seen it a little bit during the Trump administration when Kim Jong-un had to travel, or maybe on his own accord went to Beijing before the meetings or sometimes after to give a briefing, if it were, to Xi Jinping as to what transpired at the meetings. But China, I'm sure, must be somewhat unsettled by the North Korean saber rattling as well, because if North Korea, especially if it launches, if it starts another nuclear test, as I mentioned before, the South Koreans might be even more determined to get their own nuclear deterrent. There are some predictions that the South Korean public, at least, maybe not the government, but the public we could see sort of about 80% of the public saying that, well, we need a nuclear deterrent. If that were to happen, then of course Japan would follow suit, and Japan had already started under the late Shinzo Abe to sort of start to do away with Article 9 of the peace constitution and remilitarize a little bit more. Japan would follow suit in terms of a nuclear capability, most likely, and then of course Taiwan would see that as sort of the last guarantee it might have of deterring a Chinese invasion. And then, of course, we would be in a full-blown arms race, and this would become a very destabilizing region. So from a geostrategic and geopolitical point of view, there's a lot that's going on in this region that requires a lot more attention and very clear-eyed analysis going forward.
Thank you very much, Francis. That was an added value into the discussion, and then allow me to say a few things with regards to just to add value, if that's okay, with regard to how Europe sees or how Europeans see this emergence of competition that is constantly upgrading itself somehow or somewhere. There was a with a previous president of the United States, former President Trump, there was a massive attention that was provided with the attempt of the United States and the president of the United States at that time to discuss with North Korea, probably because there was also a fear of what North Korea can do, probably seen in collaboration with China in the whole East of Asia. And followed to that, there was an attempt from the United States forces to reorganize, if you want, their presence within the East Asia region, with the upgrading of the U.S. forces in Japan, where basically, if you remember, former President Trump came out and said that we're so very glad because we renewed our presence and now the Japanese are paying for it. While at the same time, we saw the Chinese building faster than ever before some islands, some air bases, while also they're upgrading their technological abilities. Suddenly, there is a very high tense discussion, and either side diplomatic political statements, if you want to call them like this, between Korea and China, where China basically threatens Korea. However, it also threatens Taiwan, and Taiwan is the most stable of the threats that China does versus the other countries that are surrounding China as well. And at some point, people try to give an interpretation of why China does this. So on the one hand, it wants to be seen in the Western world that it progresses, it does development, it has gone through different processes and different changes, while also it has expanded in other countries. And the answer, I think, is quite simple. They would like to show control of their region around them because it is a big country, so it has an ability to make damage or to create damage, while it also has the ability to operate with other countries when it comes down to development, business, but also trading goods. It was seen with the former president of the Philippines, where he had come out on TV and he was saying that we want to have a structural and strategic relationship with the United States, but we cannot afford also not mentioning China, which is next to us, and therefore is of strategic partnership and necessity to the Philippine interests. At the same time, China, being one of the biggest exporter of goods into Australia, cannot be taken away from the Australian foreign policy, because Australia is also kind of not threatened too much, but is actually seeing what is happening. There's a lot of investment, a lot of migration to Australia itself, and there is a big fear in the sense of what can China do if it goes wrong, if if it takes the wrong decisions or the wrong path, which means basically instability in the region. It seems that the Taiwan case is not going to end, probably because it started in 2020 with Hong Kong, with the opportunity of China to basically swallow Hong Kong and become one, while at the same time it gives momentum towards Taiwan, not only to be seen as Chinese territory, but also take away the powers from Taiwan and bring them over into China. Seemingly, it will not be accepted by the West, probably because Taiwan, like Korea as well, exports quite many artifacts which are very much needed to the progress of the Western world, including also cars, to say the least, and related other artifacts from TV stations to radios to internet to parts of phones and so on and so forth. So it seems that there is an ongoing trade war that has been developing throughout the latest years, which is now translated into more military or in military nature, where we see the probable elements happening almost every day, plus the fight on who controls the seas on the South Asia coast. And this is another element also with the Malacca Straits in the Southwest Asia, and goes on and on and on. But um, one thing we did not probably count on is what would happen if a war such as the one in Ukraine and Russia erupt. What would it mean into China or other Asia countries? What we see in the world is that there is a big connection with regard to what Russia has. And a lot of people in the public opinion, I think, in the European Union area, believe that somehow China sustains the war of Russia, considering that suddenly China has made very big deals with exports of goods that Russia can offer towards China. The second thing is that China has been investing quite heavily into Africa. And suddenly, in order to be in Africa, they needed to have a presence within the Arab area. And in this case, I'm not talking about the Arab Gulf, but I'm talking about Iran. There was a discussion that was agreed in 2000, that was negotiated from 2016 to 2020, end of 2020, where basically we now see the Chinese presence in Iran, which actually aims to rebuild Iran while also have a military presence for the first time with 5,000 troops in the Arab Gulf area. And that is a bit scary in the sense that Chinese not only now have an investment opportunity or see this as an investment opportunity, but also there is some sort of strategic chessboard that is being deployed from the point of the Chinese towards the world. It is of no coincidence that the Chinese had bought during the IMF period of Greece the port of Piraeus, making COSCO one of the major companies which are actually importing Chinese good into Europe. And this was the first port that COSCO bought in order to make it bigger while through Greece, go to the Balkans, and then go to the western part of Europe. It seems that there is a game of multi-dimensions, and this game of multi-dimensions is also very dangerous, considering how easily things can go sideways, if you want, considering the ongoing war in Ukraine and Russia, which is non-ending, where on the one hand, China sees and portrays itself in the G20 to be a more balanced country with the international community, but on the other hand, supporting Russia in the United Nations Security Council, as it always has done since the 50s, 1950s. So it seems that China wants to play a pivotal role. It wants to increase its presence through the BRICS, also another financial institution that was really committed into becoming the anti-IMF, anti-World Bank, or you name it. And it looks like that China wants to have a presence not only in Africa, but also in Latin America, in South America, to be specific, with their presence in Argentina. So it seems that a full game is on. The chessboard is the Earth. Major power is China. And I'm wondering whether the United States is still a power to counter China in case of that, things go sideways. I know that the United States has been engaged into exploring more the Asia region since the early 21st century. Although it was positive in nature, now it has become much more destined to be much more reliant on security elements and what may go wrong, because initially it seemed like a very big opportunity for the United States to invest into China at a time when China was becoming more urbanized and more industrialized than ever before. But it seems that China is going with high rhythms, where many more billionaires are now located into China rather than the United States, where we now have, for the third term, the president of China, Xi Jinping, being reelected, and therefore having an ultimate power with regards to how China may become or may rule. It seems that the only thing that is an obstacle, and that has been going on throughout these days, and both speakers have spoken about, is COVID. It seems that COVID is a very big reason for China to overturn at points several decisions, which means that if they can overturn decisions such as the pandemic in terms of the COVID, because it has done a very big damage into China, it seems that other things can be overturned. We are yet there to see what happens, but now there is a case that these these regimes can actually change. What I'm now going to suggest is that we take some questions. I know that Joseph has the first question, has raised his hand. Joseph, I'll give you the floor. Please tell us for whom does it refer to, and I will give the floor to the speakers.
Well, hello to our esteemed speakers. The question will refer to both of you. We're rightly talking about the possibility of China invading Taiwan, and of course the repercussions the Russian invasion has into Ukraine vis-a-vis how China will behave depending on the Western support that is still ongoing in Ukraine. Thing is that I suppose we would all agree that Russia is quite weakening by this military blunder that she got itself into. And I'm wondering whether these two frenemies, China and Russia, whether China would be best advised to leave the invasion of Taiwan as a huge sign blind and rather expand on its borders along Russia, because we're talking about a huge border. I think it's over 4,000 kilometers. It's about over 2,500 miles, with a very sparse Russian population, about 2 or 3 people per square kilometer, I think. It is in the Asian side of Russia. And I do wonder whether China would best serve its interests if it expanded into there and perhaps gain access to the Arctic itself, rather than trying to crack Taiwan, which is a very difficult not to crack, because U.S. Navy intervention I think, is more than a given in that case. And well, and if we're talking about the whole chessboard, the West is, of course, conducting a proxy war via Ukraine in weakening Russia. But how weak does the West really want Russia? What is our best interest in that regard? Do we really need a very splintered Russia, a very weak Russia? Because in that event, I suppose this whole amalgam of Russia, India, and the West against Russia will crumble in some respects.
Yeah, that's a very good multiple questions.
Yeah, because it's more better. We see a lot of articles blaming India for I don't know, taking advantage of the war in Ukraine and taking in a lot of Russian oil, but India has China to contend with as well, and
but India is also a balancing power
yeah, of
on
course,
China as well, that does a very good job with regards to securing the West.
Yeah, but the thing is that there are too many, I think, and I would say there are extremist voices in alienating even a very large country like India in that regard, which of course does a lot of balancing acts against Russia. I don't know. I'm a bit concerned that, and since we talked in the previous webinar about lots of Western thinkers starting thinking of whether the Russian Federation will splinter, especially regions that are very far away from Moscow and have a strategic value, either in oil, gas, or military installations. And if that happens, and Russia is that weak, would that be to the best advantage of the West in the long run?
Just to add on this, that there is a new bridge now connecting China and Russia together. And that bridge has been very widely celebrated because it allows for more business traffic between the two. So although we saw a lot of competition, especially for indigenous people within the borders of the two countries, now suddenly they're becoming more and more close to each other. So what do you have to say on this? I will start with Frederick.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a lot to address, but let me at least take a stab at it, and maybe Francis can take it up from there. So first of all, I would say I would say that Taiwan, Taiwan like Ukraine, Taiwan for China like Ukraine for Russia, as a double advantage. So there is the I would say ideological politic advantage, right? We all heard the discourse from Xi Jinping and also from Vladimir Putin before he invaded Ukraine, like the great Russia and so on, and Ukraine is already a country, it's ours, and so on and so forth, and like that kind of identity politics. Something similar resonate to our ears when we're listening to this reunification of China and so on and so forth. So there's something there that it's, those kinds of like tensions are deeply ingrained in a political symbolism. The other thing is, and that's probably the real motivator, it's the economy behind it. And I will give it to you that the war on the ground in Ukraine is not doing very well, and not going very well for Russia. But I can tell you that the takeover of the Black Sea is going fairly well for Russia, right? So on the 23rd of February, Russia was not in a grain deal with the rest of the world, and on the 24th, it is, or something like that, right? So you see that kind of control of areas and control of world's needed resources. And I would probably make the same argument for Taiwan and China. Taiwan as this kind of like symbolism for China, but China is also very like aware and acutely aware of the value of the Taiwan Strait and the impact on the global economy. Now you made a comment also that was interesting that still involved China and Russia. It's the Arctic. So interestingly enough, one of my master's students just completed an assessment of what's going on in the Arctic, and clearly the Russian as the upper hand right now in controlling and having and establishing a presence there. So I can really see, like the economic advantage and dominance of a let's not say an alliance, but at least a cooperation between Russia and China that could have ground in a military cooperation, but which the outcome is an economic dominance on major waterways for commerce and trade, where it would give China and Russia ways to choke Europe, the Middle East, in some part, maybe some of the west coast of the US. And create like a nightmare in terms of like a dominance in the 21st century economy. The other thing is, China has been also showing clearly that it can change, right? I was in West and Central Africa from 2000 to 2012, like back and forth for work and consultancy and so on. And when you saw the Chinese going there to invest, it was only in exactly that, only like in infrastructure, in the farming and so on and so forth. And when negotiator on the African side, or like the country where I was, like Cameroon or other countries, were starting to talk about military material and so on, China was backing out. So no way, we're not doing any kind of military transfer of technology or something like that. We're not doing that. And clearly now they're changing. I mean, not necessarily for Africa, but at least in the Middle East. You mentioned Iran with the presence of China, and it's changing also its stance, on other things too. Like I mentioned before in my introduction, what happened with Hong Kong and the promise that it made about Hong Kong. And also the U.S. has conducted an assessment about the stand, the aggressive stand of China toward the West, and military mostly, and that also has increased. So clearly there is a tension is rising, but tension is probably like the military tension is rising much more to establish, I believe, the outcome. The lookout is a economic dominance for the 21st century, right? If you look to the value of Ukraine, you have the grain that I talked about, but there is also like key component, rare gas and rare metal in Ukraine that could be very, very helpful for China to continue to support its rise to the microchip and other high tech, things. So and Ukraine is not the only one, but I'm saying like that is also the big prize. The Black Sea is, I mean, you know that, guys. I mean, the Black Sea is full of like resource oil, gas, and so on. Controlling that with Turkey is also a great deal there in terms of economic benefits and outcome. And another thing, and I will finish on that because I really want to give time to Francis. But another thing that is interesting is on one side, we see Iran backing down with his morality police and abolishing the morality police in response to the protest. And we see, for example, China backing down on some of the most, like, I would say, severe COVID measures. But it also reinforced their position about the West meddling, because both have accused the West as being behind the organization and the support of those groups. And I really believe that will bring to them a more radicalized reading of their future, I would say, position and posture against the West. And here, if we look at a opposition that is protesting in the streets of China, it makes even probably want the regime taking away Taiwan that represent this bastion of democracy and liberty and so on and so forth. That is really a rock in its shoe right now. If you look at, like the kind of regime it wants to maintain and this kind of close authoritarianism that it wants to maintain, it will probably increase its interest in shutting down Taiwan and making one with China, which could precipitate a confrontation with the West. So I will stop right there.
Thank you, Frederick. One of the things I was looking last year for a close conference, I was looking on Taiwan, and I was looking on the military balance between Taiwan and China in case this ever takes place, and they're going to try to swallow them. And it seems obviously Taiwan in the long run loses, assuming that nobody else gets involved, which is not the case. And we also did not say how Japan may react into this, because Japan also has a big thing into this. And the fact that they're militarizing themselves suddenly now also matters. But so it seems that South Korea can actually do a damage. I'm sorry, Taiwan can actually do a damage into China. Maybe not on the extended level that somebody might think, but definitely on the coastal line. Now, one of the things that I think that China plays is this authoritarianism, even in military affairs, because they're trying to project not in being peaceful, at least on paper, but rather they want to, as you said, they want to swallow them. And I think they want to swallow everybody who they do business with regards to their investment schemes. And that's what they're doing also in Iran. Iran is accusing the West of pushing into these things, but I also believe that China is pushing Iran into making these alterations, because they need these structural changes to take place if Iran is to play the game of the global trading hub. And it kind of makes sense, because China wants stability. And with this regime, the way that things were progressing up until these days, Iran is not really stable or good for business, even if it is global. And even if China wants to play the role of a stabilizer, it wants to play a role that it can control. And the only way that it can control it is if it becomes a bit, like an open society, at least in the terms of business, and open social society that China is actually investing into. I just wanted to add this comment. I don't know if it's of too much value to it, but I hope it just would add some extra value to what you just said, considering that things are volatile. And as things progress, we're also yet to see what is the future of Hong Kong. We are yet to see what is the future of North-South Korea dialogue. what is the future with the strategic relationship vis-a-vis Australia or Indonesia or the Philippines or even Vietnam vis-a-vis China. So Francis, what do you have to say on all of these questions and the comments?
Well, the one thing I would let me go back to Joseph's initial sort of starting point of his question about sort of the comparison between Ukraine and Russia and then Taiwan and China. I think it's fair to say that the Chinese government has been paying very careful attention to how the Russian invasion has been going or not going well, rather, and drawing careful lessons from that, because the consensus might have been that, well, the Russian military juggernaut, once it gets moving and they can swallow up Ukraine, probably very few predicted the kind of the stalemate that the Russians have found themselves in, if not the losses that they have incurred. And so the Chinese must probably be asking themselves if something similar might happen to them in the short term. In the long term, I think both of those powers would probably prevail. But then there's a broader question that comes in, and this goes back to also some of the points that Frederick just mentioned, that at the end, everything is about economic dominance. And really, I think in the 21st century, yes, military might, it always has mattered throughout history, but now I think we're in an era where economic power dwarfs military power consistently. And China has been playing very strategically, I think, in that sense. If you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. I mean, if we go back and look at the Cold War, when the United States, last had a grand strategy of dealing with war, it was probably in 1948, 49 under Harry Truman. If you look at what China is doing right now, the Belt and Road Initiative is a very peculiar grand strategy, but it's built around economic dominance, connectivity. And so they're leveraging their economic power that they have accumulated over decades of economic reform and restructuring. And if you look throughout history and you take a geographic perspective for a moment, you will see that the Belt and Road Initiative has two major components. I mean, first it was called the One Belt, One Road. So there's the belt that actually goes through Central Asia, or the Eurasian heartland. And the road, it's the maritime Silk Road. And if you look at it from a geographical point of view, you go back to the early 20th century. Halford Mackinder wrote about the geographical pivot of history, and he talked about the heartland. Whoever controls the heartland will control sort of the world island. Nicholas Spikeman by 1945 came and talked about the rimland. And if you control the rimland, you control the heartland, and then by extension, you control the world island. And China's playing on both axes simultaneously. So there's a really strategic perspective in that, and they're leveraging the economic power. Now, when it comes to the Taiwan issue, I don't see necessarily China going to the extreme and taking measures like Russia did with regard to Ukraine for several reasons. One, the Chinese government brings up the Taiwan issue from the perspective of irredentist nationalism. When they have economic problems or social problems at home, you always want to deflect attention, and the Chinese government has been very careful to nurture a new sense of nationalism in China. The whole idea of the Zhongguomeng, or the China Dream, is all about nationalism. And yes, Taiwan used to be part of China. Nobody would dispute that. What the Communist Party has never been in control of Taiwan. But at the same time, Taiwan has been the single largest investor in China. And so there would be an economic cost to be paid, certainly, not to mention the economic sanctions that would be leveled against China for sure. There's also the question of Taiwan being a major player in the global economy when it comes to chip manufacturing. And China is not there yet. Now, what the US has done in its so-called chip war and so on to strangle China from that perspective, it has emboldened China to sort of build up its domestic capability. It will take them some time, for sure, to get to that level of having the 5 and the 3 nanometer chips and so on. But if China were to launch an attack against Taiwan, it would also economically, at least in the short term, shoot itself in the foot. So China, I think, is playing it pragmatically for now, and I don't see Xi Jinping, despite his rhetoric, taking any near-term measures. Now, where it gets complicated is, of course, if the West looks at the situation in Asia primarily through a security lens, and if the name of the game is to effectively contain China, and you do that by building up your military presence, having that force projection capability, the forward military presence, like the US had done before to respond to North Korean aggression with the deployment of the THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. The Chinese reacted to that. So any buildup, any military buildup on the part of the West is going to get China's attention for sure. Are they going to react militarily? Maybe not in the near term, but they will leverage their economic weapon for sure. When South Korea had acquiesced to the US demand to deploy the THAAD missile defense system, the Chinese started launching an economic warfare. They curtailed tour groups from going to South Korea. They made it extremely difficult, if not nearly impossible, for Korean conglomerates to operate in China, and that really hurt the South Korean economy as well. So that's the game that I see China playing in the near term. Now, where the US and the West more broadly sometimes might not fully understand the picture is when you look at the South China Sea, which, Marius, you had brought up before as well. There's no denying that China is militarizing and weaponizing the South China Sea with the man-made islands. And you had, I think it was Hu Jintao or Hu Jintao probably before, maybe even Xi Jinping. Yeah, it was Xi Jinping who once told a previous president, a U.S. president, that, well, we will not militarize the South China Sea. That's exactly what they have done. But you look at it from a lens of history. Any great power, when you have more economic interests around the world, you are going to secure those interests, the trade routes and so on. China is keenly aware that the Malacca Strait that, Marius, that you mentioned, that is a maritime choke point for sure. There's I think it's the largest percentage of global trade goes through that very narrow strait. That could easily be blocked, and China would suffer quite a bit as a result. So their force projection capability in the South China Sea is a way to also keep those shipping lanes open for themselves, as it's to safeguard their trade routes, essentially. Similar to what the US has done. It projects its power around the world because they have economic and national interest. And so that's something that we have to understand going forward. And then we have a basis to actually engage China in more constructive ways. But I fully agree with what Frederick has also said, that at the end of the day, it really boils down to economic influence, economic power. That's the name of the game. That's what China has been playing its cards very well throughout the world, investing in all over Africa, in South America, Central America, the Middle East, in Europe with not just the Piraeus port, but there's also a port in Germany. I think that a Chinese company has sort of a controlling a stake, not operationally, but the Chinese are investing in infrastructure in terms of connectivity. And it's not surprising that they also target developing countries. Of course, the concern was, well, you get the developing countries into a debt trap, and then if they can't pay up, if you give them loans and so on, then the Sri Lanka example is always mentioned. The Hambantota port, when the Sri Lankan government said, whoops, we can't repay the loan, not a problem, we'll just take over the port. And now we have an ability for the Chinese Navy to sort of project their influence. And of course, that was strategic because now you keep an eye on India as well. But there were some studies that were done that actually said that the whole debt trap is a little bit blown out of proportion. And even if it is, China is expanding its influence. It's tying the fortunes of those countries more towards China. And when you look at the U.S. allies in Asia, South Korea and Japan, I think they're caught between a rock and a hard place. Certainly South Korea. From a security point of view, yes, you want to be allied maybe more with the United States to hedge against China. From an economic point of view, your economic fortunes are deeply intertwined with those of China. And China is keenly aware of that as well. So it's playing the U.S. allies off against each other and against the U.S. by using that economic card. And so far, I don't see a very clear understanding on the part of the US to grapple with that. There's no clear answer to that geostrategic reality. I think we still are looking at the world primarily from a military and security lens when the world has become a lot more complex. Now, if everything revolves around the economy, China is also in a somewhat weaker situation right now because the COVID restrictions and the whole COVID pandemic has significantly impacted the Chinese economy. You also had seen many companies relocating out of China, especially during the trade war that President Trump had launched, and companies moving to Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia. Now, of course, the argument was that when China lifts the COVID restrictions, well, it's going to breathe new life into the economy. Businesses won't have all those restrictions. But there's another concern that has been raised now, and that is that with its COVID zero policy, the Chinese government has not invested enough in safeguarding its population, especially the elderly population. The vaccination rate is not where it should be. The vaccines that they used are not nearly as effective as the Western alternatives. So if and when those restrictions are really lifted, there's probably going to be another economic impact because China is not currently prepared, according to some predictions, for yet another wave of the pandemic. And then that might compel Western companies again to look for alternative locations for their own investments potentially.
Francis, thank you very much for this analysis. Actually, while you were talking, I just kept one of the things that Taiwan is one of the biggest investors into China. And it seems that Taiwan is also investing heavily in the United States, because I'm reading here Reuters 5 hours ago. The Taiwanese chip maker TSMC said it would then triple its planned investment at its new Arizona plant to $40 billion, among the largest investments in U.S. history, as President Joe Biden visited and held the project. So this is very interesting. And I'm pretty sure that we're going to have the opportunity to talk even more, because we're going to do a webinar about China itself, because you can understand that China cannot be just examined at this point. We're more examining Asia than China, but obviously we cannot avoid talking about China. And I know that we have here with us Stefano, the lady who has been into China for about 15, I think, or 18 years into China. So you've done quite many businesses in China. And we do reserve him to have the opportunity to give us his own opinions in and about China in a near webinar close to you, where we're going to have to explore basically what is China, what does China represent, and how it envisions itself in the near future in the international arena. By saying all these things, I would like to thank very much both Professor Frederick and Professor Francis for joining us at this second webinar, which we do want to continue, and we'll continue onwards with more things to come and more issues to discuss. Next week, we are there yet to discuss one of the most important things at the international agenda, which is energy security. And with this being said, I would like to thank you all for joining us, and do join us for the next webinars to come. Ladies and gentlemen, dear honored guests, dear speakers, thank you very much for joining us at Strategy International. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.